Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In the last decade, there have been growing calls for reparations for the past harms of the British Empire and arguments over whether Australia was invaded by the British or merely an uninvited intrusion. Joining me to discuss the moral legacy of the British Empire is theologian and ethicist Professor Nigel Biggar. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Nigel.
Thank you, Georgina.
It's wonderful to have you here at the Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne, and we're right in the middle of exam period, so you'll hear the dulcet tones of very nervous students as they enter the exam hall.
I'm used to that.
And you would be used to it. Nigel, it's your first visit to Australia, so welcome. You've written an absolute bestseller of a book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Of course, it focuses on the British Empire and the morality of the actions of the empire and whether there were things in the good ledger or the bad ledger. Can you start by explaining for our listeners what was the British Empire? Because unfortunately, I think there probably isn't as good an understanding as there should be about what it was and the time span and you know what we actually mean when we say the British Empire.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the current popular notion of the empire is that it was one thing. So we talk about colonialism as if it was a single project, and the project was racist and exploitative and oppressive. It was a simple thing, whereas the historical truth is a whole lot more complicated and frankly a whole lot more interesting. So the empire spanned 400 years, from roughly 1550 to 1960, and it stretched from Western Canada, Vancouver, to Newfoundland in Eastern Canada, to Africa, to India, to Australia, to New Zealand. It was global. And unsurprisingly, the British Empire was different things at different times in different places, sometimes different things in different places at the same time. So it's quite hard to generalize, and you certainly cannot reduce the British Empire to racism, oppression, and exploitation, because sometimes it was the very opposite. Just to take one example, yes, for 150 years, some Britons, not all, some Britons were involved in slave trading and slavery. But then from 1807 with the abolition of slave trading and 1833 with the abolition of slavery, Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish both, and then spent the next 150 years, the second half of the empire's life, suppressing slavery. So the British Empire was both slavery, but then also anti-slavery.
Yeah, so as you say, it had a lot of contradictions within itself.
And it could just point out, it's common sense that if you think of any long-standing state that lasted 400 years, you're going to find contradictions. So it's really no surprise there, and the British Empire is no exception.
In recent years, the British Empire has been pretty seriously denigrated for perpetrating atrocities and tragedies, and there's a whole field of post-colonial studies now that are intent on casting the British Empire as basically, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. So why is it that this phenomenon has taken hold, and not just hold at sort of an academic level, it's actually institutionally entrenched now?
Yeah, it's a really good and puzzling question because the historical data don't support that kind of cartoonish story about the imperial past. But this notion that the empire was nothing but a litany of racism, etc., has taken hold. I think partly because most people in Australia and Britain and Canada and New Zealand know very little about the history. And so when you find some zealots who are saying that it was nothing but evil, most people have no historical knowledge with which to fight back. So I think historical ignorance has a lot to do with it. Also, I think, it's remarkable that the critics of empire have no interest in non-white empires. Long before Europeans got involved in it, there were the Chinese, there were the Aztecs, there were the Assyrians, certainly the Arabs, there were the Zulus. No one cares about those empires. They only care about white empires, and in particular the British Empire. So that raises the question, why this focus? And I think the reason for the focus is that the British Empire is a proxy for the West. There's reason for that. From 1815 until well after the First World War, the British Empire was the leading power of the West and spread Western ideas all over the world. And then during the Second World War, America clearly came to the fore and took over the leadership of the West. So there's a continuity between the American-led West now and the British-led West up until the Second World War. And so what's happened is that the British Empire is a proxy for the West and is a target for those on the left who tend to think that the woes of the world are the West's fault. So that's the reason for the left-wing focus on the British Empire.
In Britain, how much is taught in schools and universities about the British Empire? Is it sort of verboten these days, or is it a popular subject?
So I'm 69 now, and I went to school in the 60s and 70s. And I grew up actually during the period of decolonisation, so I was vaguely aware of it. And my first degree was in history, and my first love has always been history. I'm always reading a history book at one time or another. And so I've read a lot about it. And so I know a lot about it, but I'm aware that what I know is not widely known. And so I think the answer to your question is, until recently, probably most school syllabuses didn't feature the empire at all. I mean, when I was at school, perhaps it was rather unimaginative, but in school, the course of school education, one learned about the whole, as it were, chronology of British history from Roman times to the modern period. One got a sense of the growth of the country and the development of the country, and that would include the empire. Now, history tends to be taught in sort of modules, and particularly quite designed to try and connect with the experience and feelings of youngsters. So what did it feel like to be in the trenches, and was it fun being a slave, that kind of thing. But there's no sense of continuity or development here. So I suspect nowadays, particularly since colonialism became a hot topic, and particularly since colonialism is generally denigrated as the source of current systemic racism, school kids will be taught, if anything, about the empire. They'll be taught about how wicked and evil it was. And I think that's very dangerous in terms of the politics of the future and in terms of national identity and national self-confidence.
Now, your book is a moral reckoning of colonialism, and you come at it as an ethicist,
yes,
not a historian, although you do have a degree in history. How difficult is it then to write a history book with a sort of an ethical lens? I mean, is that not what the post-colonial studies professors are doing as well? It's sort of imposing a sort of, I guess, a political view on a period of history and playing the role more as activist or ethicist in this way to tell the story of our past?
No, you're absolutely right, Georgina. So I don't complain against the decolonisers that they have a moral point of view. I complain about two things. I first of all complain that they pretend they don't have a moral point of view, whereas in my book I'm absolutely clear, and the reader will find out in the introduction what my moral point of view is, and it's absolutely patent, and the reader can take it or leave it. They can judge for themselves. But what I've discovered about my anti-colonialist decolonising critics is that, first of all, they complain about an ethicist trespassing on their turf. And then they pretend that, as grown-up historians, that they're above all this rather naive moral business that theologians get into. But if you look at what they write, it is quite clear that their interpretation of the facts is infused with deep moral prejudices. So I don't mind them making moral judgments. I just wish they were more self-aware of their moral prejudices and lay them out before the reader so that they can judge. And the other complaint I have is that their moral judgments about the colonial past are poor judgments because their interpretation involves highly partisan selectivity. So when decolonisers talk about the British Empire, they like to equate it with slavery, completely ignoring the fact that for the second half of his life, as I've said, the British Empire was actually engaged in anti-slavery. So it's the partisan selectivity that distorts the moral judgment that I complain about.
Mm. When you were thinking about embarking on this project to write this book, it was the time of the Scottish independence referendum, wasn't it? This was sort of a catalytic moment for you, wasn't it, in terms of your journey towards
absolutely
publication? Of course, publication wasn't easy.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, I've been reading about imperial history for a long time, partly because as a Briton growing up in the 60s and the whole decolonising thing, it threw up very conflicting emotions and a sense of the loss of power. And I think I spent the whole of my life trying to come to terms with that. And so I had been reading about imperial history for a long time. Come 2014, as an Anglo-Scot with English mother, Scottish father, educated both sides of the border, I was a natural opponent of Scottish independence during the referendum held in 2014. But I felt morally obliged to look at the arguments of Scottish nationalists just to see whether perhaps they might be right. Since I don't believe that nations are forever, they do come and they go. Maybe the UK's natural life had come to an end. I didn't like it, like the prospect, but I had to admit maybe it was true. So I looked at various nationalist arguments, and one can be distilled into the following equation: Britain equals empire equals evil. And I knew that the equation empire equals evil is not historically tenable. But that was the moment, Georgina, when I realized that colonial history is politically potent. It's being abused for political purposes that I regarded as destructive. And that's when I thought, actually, it's important for someone to write a more balanced account of the whole story to correct this, in the case of the Scottish independence, a destructive campaign that would have led to the disintegration of the UK.
Was part of the Scottish campaign for independence that it wanted to be divorced from a racist power, a formerly
yes.
Racist
yes,
power?
So Britain equals evil, according to the nationalists, because yes, it was racist, and yes, it was dominating other peoples, and yes, it was committing genocides all over the world. And so the empire was a wicked, dominating Western project, and Scotland, in separating from the UK, would cleanse itself, repent of this wicked imperial British past, and sail off into a bright, new, shiny, sin-free, probably European future.
It's so ahistorical. Australia is colonised by the British, and obviously we get convicts coming here in the late 18th, 19th century. We also get a lot of free settlers, and a lot of them come from Scotland. So actually a lot of Australia's intellectual heft, its early lawyers, its politicians, its business people, its philanthropists were Scots. So we are built on the best and brightest of Scotland coming to Australia. And yet
absolutely,
that sort of wanting to completely divorce one's country from the empire project, which, from Australia's perspective, the Scottish contribution was huge and overwhelmingly positive.
I mean, the union of Scotland with England gave Scots the opportunity to use the empire to expand their influence in a way that little Scotland by itself could never have done. So, I mean, my name is Biggar. It's a Scottish name, at least for the last 1,000 years it was. It was originally French. But if you go to Ontario, there's Biggar Lake, Biwar. If you go to Saskatchewan in Canada, there's the township of Biggar. There is the Biggarsburg in South Africa. I'm hunting in Australia for something that has
We'll
my
find
name.
it, Nigel. Don't worry, we'll find it.
I did find a John Biggar on one of your memorials in Sydney. So, the Scots ran the empire.
And, of course, Robert Menzies,
of course.
I spend a lot of time talking about here, particularly on this podcast, is a proud Scot, proud of his Scottish heritage. So the British Empire, it's 400 years span, it grows, it becomes the largest empire. What was the motivating factor for that? Was it sort of a power-hungry push, world domination? Was it a racist push? I mean, obviously the critics would say all of those.
No, I mean, if you just think of the way that we live our individual lives and governments live their lives and states live their lives, I mean, so much of what we do is reactive. Things happen, and we react, and we take opportunities or whatever. So unsurprisingly, the empire was very ad hoc oftentimes. There was no big plan. No, nobody woke up in London one Sunday morning and said, ooh, let's go conquer the world. That'd be fun. No, it was, just to give an example, the earliest signs of English empire were the setting up of outposts on the eastern coast of North America. Why? To some extent, people went out there to find gold. They had legends of El Dorado in North America, but they're also there to harry Spanish shipping, because the Spanish Empire dominated Europe and threatened Protestant England. And so ironically, the origins of English empire in North America were anti-imperialist. And then at the same time, English merchants are going eastward to India, the East India Company, to do what? To trade, to make profit. Nothing wrong with that as such. So there's no plan at the beginning to go conquer the world, but once you end up with traders in India, the East India Company discovers that much of India is anarchical. There's lots of conflict and warfare. War is not good for trade, not good for commerce. And so the East India Company is invited by one Indian prince to ally itself and go to war against another one. The East India Company does that, they win. As a reward, they get territories and ports. So it's incremental, one thing after another. But trade, I mean, the whole, ruling other peoples is expensive. And London then doesn't want to spend the money. Trade was a large motive. In the case of Australia, of course, initially it was setting up a convict colony, which may sound like a bad thing to do, but transporting convicts to Australia was better than hanging them in England, which was the alternative.
Yeah, and was there a sense that it was spreading Christian ideas and liberal ideas around the world? Was there that ingrained in the idea of empire?
That came a bit later. So, I mean, the origins of empire, as I say, go back to the second half of the 1500s in North America and the 1600s in India. At that point, no, there was no, as it were, mission. But in the late 1700s in England, you have a kind of moral revolution where people become increasingly of the view that slavery is morally abhorrent. So there's the movement to abolish slave trading and then slavery, which was successful. And then that expanded in the 1800s to a concern for the plight of Aboriginal peoples, not least in Australia, in the face of the shock of modernity arriving. So the empire acquires a humanitarian mission, often through government in London being lobbied by missionaries and humanitarians. In my view, that becomes an increasing component of the empire, so that there is a notion that bringing a British civilization to Aboriginal Australia is good for Aborigines, and the same with Africans. Of course, as we know, the course of progress in Australia was not straightforward, and the impact of British modernity on Australia was sometimes very shocking to native peoples. But the aim was to draw native peoples like the Aborigines into a unitary Australian nation as equal citizens. And whatever the ups and downs of progress, the fact of the matter is that right now, Aboriginal Australians, alongside other Australians, have the privilege of living in one of the most prosperous and one of the most liberal countries on earth.
Well, indeed. I mean, the facts speak for themselves there. The narrative these days is that Australia was invaded. The continent of Australia was invaded by the British and taken over sort of in a hostile way, and that the Aboriginal people were slaughtered in a variety of frontier wars, and their land was taken away. They died from introduced diseases. That this was an all-round atrocious event that happened to the Indigenous people of Australia. You have a different interpretation, which is probably an interpretation that we used to have in Australia, that there was a settlement of Australia, we were colonised, but it was done in a much more benign way in our traditional telling than the contemporary telling. And of course now we get calls, very, very noisy calls every year around Australia Day, the 26th of January, to scrap it and change the date because it represents a sort of invasion of Australia, and Indigenous people call it Sorry Day. There are culture wars around the foundations of British settlement of Australia. So, I mean, how do you interpret it through your work, through your book, and more broadly?
So the first thing I do, Georgina, is to set what happened in Australia in context, and that's what the anti-colonialist critics don't want to do. So the first thing I'd say is the movement of peoples and the displacement of others was a universal phenomenon, and non-white peoples were doing it before white peoples did it. So in the 1600s, the Iroquois in North America expand northwards across the Great Lakes, displaced the Huron. They had a quaint method of assimilation. They adopted the women and children and ate the males. And then when the Maori...
Lucky that didn't catch on with other tribes
and
races.
yeah. And when the Maori invaded the Chatham Islands in 1835, they slaughtered 10% of the Moriora population and enslaved the rest. So when you're thinking about what Arthur Phillip did landing in Sydney Cove in 1788, you need to compare it to those. And relative to those, whatever he did was a lot more humane. And it's quite clear that Phillip himself was a very extraordinarily humane man. So was Lachlan Macquarie. That's the first thing I say. The second thing I say is, yes, there was conflict between settlers and Aborigines at various points, but there wasn't only conflict. Certainly in the early days in Sydney, and I'm sure elsewhere too, Aborigines found themselves attracted to what was going on in Sydney, not least because after a while, the settlers in Sydney were producing more secure supplies of food. And also, whether in Australia or Africa or North America, unsurprisingly, there were certain features of the culture of the settlers that native peoples found attractive. So it wasn't all conflict, and it wasn't all the unwanted imposition of culture on a foreign people. And the third thing I say is, just repeat what I said before, that the aim of certainly the imperial government of London and colonial governments in Australia was never annihilation. It was never apartheid. It was integration as equal citizens under the law into a unified Australia. And, compared to what was an offer from the Maori, compared to what would have been an offer from the Iroquois if they'd come to Australia, that was a much more humane and egalitarian form of intrusion. Now, it's no doubt the settlers were not invited to Australia by the Aboriginals, but the fact of the matter is, the world was coming to Aboriginal Australia one way or another, sooner or later, and I think what Arthur Phillip brought was probably the most benign intrusion that the native Aborigines could have expected.
It's become a contested issue, the commemoration of frontier wars. So we have an Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It commemorates Australians killed in various wars throughout our history. Obviously World War II, World War I, Vietnam War, even Afghanistan, Iraq, Boer War. The frontier wars are now beginning to be commemorated, and the lives lost, obviously largely of Indigenous people, but there would have been some British settlers, soldiers who would have been killed too. What's your view of commemorating those sorts of battles?
Yes.
In a context where the Australian War Memorial is that a place that is supposed to be devoid of politics. It's a place of solemnity, of honour of sacrifice. It is a place imbued with nationalism and patriotism. And then the frontier wars sort of throw something very challenging, I think, into the debate there, because that does sort of come to the credibility, the legitimacy of the Australian nation.
Yeah. I agree that's an important issue. There's nothing wrong with being honest about the whole truth about one's past. And other countries like the United States have had civil wars, and there are monuments to both sides. But I think if you're going to have memorials to the frontier wars, let's have the settlers who were killed as well as the Aborigines. Because, yes, although there may well have been malicious people, settlers who wanted Aborigines dead, there were probably vengeful Aborigines who wanted settlers dead. So there was probably malice on both sides. And in both cases, people in Australia, settler and Aborigine, find themselves in a situation they didn't necessarily create. They landed there. I mean, the convicts were brought here. Were they going to go back to England, or were they going to make a new life here? Well, they wanted to make a new life here. So there's an element here, as in so much of life, of tragedy, of tragic conflict. So let's have commemoration of the whole truth. People on both sides died. There's a national dispute as to where the fault lay, but it's a national dispute. There's not just one story. So my worry about commemorating the frontier wars in a partisan way is it becomes a political weapon in favour of a kind of division of Australia into two ethnicities, Aboriginal ethnicity and the rest. And that's going to be bad for everybody, and it's not going to do anything good for race relations in Australia. So it's the manner of commemoration that matters.
Something else that I've observed is how people will label Aboriginal people as having one identity.
Yes.
Which, couldn't be further from the truth.
Yes.
These are people, if you're living in what we now call the Northern Territory or Victoria, you are thousands of kilometres apart. You will never meet, would have never met 300 years ago. So, how difficult is it to have these debates using the labels and values of 2024 on a time that, and the context was just, so very different?
It's one of the features of the anti-colonialists or the anti-racists that following radical black politics in America, they divide the world into black and white. So you've got whites and you've got blacks, you've got Europeans and Aborigines. And in Britain, we had a commission that reported about 3 years ago, in which the commission, 9 out of 10 commissioners were not white Britons. And one of the things the commission said is, can we stop talking about black and white? Because actually, in terms of social outcomes from different ethnic groups, the outcomes are very different for different kinds of non-white people. And by the way, the people at the bottom of the heap are whites. So let's complexify this. And yes, of course, not all Aborigines voted in favour of the voice to Parliament, for example. So whether now and in the past there was no Aboriginal nation in the past. There were lots of usually small, what should we call them, clans. There was no Aboriginal nation. I believe Australian Aborigines were actually formed of a number of different races that came across from what's now Southeast Asia. They weren't simply one ethnicity. So they push now to have an Aboriginal flag representing the Aboriginal nation. This is not a restoration of anything. This is an invention. And I think it's in danger of becoming an ethnically divisive invention. And that's what I hesitate as a non-Australian to say this, but as an outsider, that's what I would worry about if I were Australian.
It is interesting, these modern day inventions, even what we have a welcome to country and acknowledgement of country is something that is developed in the last, it's developed definitely in my lifetime, but within, even the latter half of my lifetime, it is very recent phenomenon. It's completely adopted institutionally in Australia, but troubles some people. Is it seems to have come from overseas, has it? Or is it co-opting some practices in Australia but using overseas traditions? And so these sort of modern day inventions that are often heavily imbued with political activism, how do they help?
I don't know about the history of the development of this notion in Australia, but I'm aware that it's been happening in the United States and in Canada for some time. I suspect you may have brought it from there. And critics in Canada, so the First Nations people in Canada claim that, their people have been on this bit of land from time immemorial. This is ancestral land, and the whites came in and took it from them. But critics will say, but that's an historical myth, because as I've suggested earlier, native peoples in America were constantly moving and pushing each other off land. So there wasn't a static situation. So the fact that whites arrive and push some Native Americans off land, and by the way, often land was purchased, some land was vacant, but the fact of the displacement of Native Americans by white settlers, the Europeans were just the latest people to intrude. And I'd be very surprised if the situation in Aboriginal Australia were different. I know there's this notion that Aboriginal Australians have a religious attachment to a particular territory, and I'm willing to be educated in that. But I do think I've certainly read there's evidence that there was the movement of populations, not within their own territory, but from one people's territory to another, because climatic conditions had made habitation of the original territory no longer sustainable. The people necessarily move to survive, and they collide with another people and displace them. So this displacement phenomenon, I'd be very surprised if that wasn't typical of Aboriginal Australia. So to pretend that somehow a particular Aboriginal people have been on this land forever, well, it may not be true. And the other thing that disturbs me about the Welcome to Country is it kind of implies that the Australian nation, which was not built by Aborigines, it was built by Europeans. The nation as you now have it, comprising the whole continent, was not an Aboriginal creation, although Aboriginals have contributed to it, like Asians and Indians and Chinese and Greeks. This was a creation of the British Empire, and what the Welcome to Country can imply is that creation is illegitimate. And I think that's not helpful for the political future of Australia, and not helpful for race relations. It doesn't help to make 97% of Australia feel guilty. It just doesn't.
Well, I don't think it contributes to a sense of social cohesion and sense of national unity. There's definitely a canker there. The King and Queen were recently in Australia, and one of the senators for Victoria, the state you're in at the moment, protested very loudly about their presence in Australia and asked for treaty and reparations and, give me back my land and, the like. You can, I'm sure, see her full display on YouTube.
I watched it.
Excellent.
Very dramatic performance.
Look, she certainly has a small following, but she has a following, the sort of Black Power movement in Australia, Black Sovereign, movement in Australia. The idea of treaty and reparations, reparations certainly is a very vexed issue in the UK with reparations to the sort of successors of slaves. They must be sort of 20 generations distant from their ancestors who were slaves. But this sort of idea of paying reparations for the sins of the British Empire In your view, where does it end? Can it ever end, that argument? Because, I mean, it seems to me that a government in 2024 or the king in 2024 doesn't have much in the way of connection aside from an institutional connection to people of 200 years ago. And yet you're trying to right the wrongs of, many centuries past with some money in the pockets of people who might actually have quite good lives. And, well, in the case of a lot of Australians have very good lives comparatively when you look at the global scene.
No, I agree. I'm generally sceptical of claims for reparations, partly because first of all, what happened to Aboriginal Australians in the early 1800s, and not everything happened to them was bad, by the way, but when bad things did happen to them, when unjust things did happen to them, there's nothing we can do for them. They're dead. Nothing we can do for them. What we can do is address current problems that some, and I believe a minority, of Aboriginal Australians suffer in remote communities. And so that's the first thing. We can't do anything about the dead. And second thing to say is that the outcomes for Aboriginal Australians vary. So, as I understand it, 20% of Aboriginal Australians live in remote communities that often suffer severe social dysfunctions. 80% of Aboriginal Australians, like other Australians, are wage earners, live in cities. I gather the outcomes for them are not perhaps quite the same as for other ethnic groups in Australia, but the gap is closing. So it's not true that the outcomes for all Aborigines has been bad. And most Aboriginal people in Australia, I gather, are mixed blood, so that they're both settler and Aborigine. So who are you making reparations to exactly? Who are the Aborigines here? So I think trying to untangle the jungle of the past and all the different causal connections 200 years on, you can't do it rationally. Much better to focus your attention on contemporary unjust disadvantages and to solve those. So focus on whatever the causes of current disadvantage. Some of them may lie 200 years ago, but other things have happened since to cause some Aborigines to languish, other Aborigines to flourish. Let's find the most practical ways of attending to current unjust disadvantage.
The culture wars, we call it culture wars in Australia, and there's sort of history wars as well around, is it an invasion or was it a colonisation, and were these good things or bad things? And of course the criticism of the West and Western civilization and these Enlightenment values, it's very, very current and hard fought here in Australia and no doubt in the UK. You've set up a new foundation, Forrest Foundation, based in Oxford, to support free thinkers and I guess the values of Western civilization and making sure that they are studied and that scholars are supported to keep working in those fields. Why is it so important that we have a fight over culture and Western values? I mean, the other option is just allow the sort of evolution of social thought, of political thought, to dismiss a whole kind of legacy and history of institution building and the building of political thought to deliver us the freedoms of today. But, maybe the post-colonial scholars are right and we should just cede space. It's their turn now.
So I think there are two answers to that question. First of all, Western civilization takes different forms and has given rise to all sorts of different things. And, you and I could dispute, which bits of Western civilization we value and don't value. So there's room for controversy about what's valuable at Western civilization. But I think you and I and many, many other people, majority of people, would say that Western civilization has produced some really important institutions and values that deserve to be preserved and promoted. So the first answer to the question is that some things about Western civ are valuable and deserve protection and promotion and conservation. Second thing is, it seems to me, right now, the global situation is that seriously, aggressively, illiberal states in Russia, in Iran, in China, in North Korea, are posing a threat to the liberal democracies of the West that they have not posed for 20, 30 years. So if the story, the West record is nothing but a litany of racism, oppression, and exploitation, if that gains traction in the West, our self-confidence in defending what's valuable in Western civilization that's been bequeathed to us will be weakened. And if the rest of the world comes to believe the decolonizing story, our diplomatic power, our soft power, will be destroyed. And we in the West, I think, because I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War, subsequent generations have become distant from that. And a lot of us, I think, have come to take for granted our wealth and prosperity and security as a fact of life. It's part of the cosmic furniture. It is nothing of the sort. It was fought for, it was built, it cost our ancestors lives and money and effort, and it can be lost. We could lose it. And therefore, by all means, let's be honest about our past, the bad stuff, but let us be equally honest about what in our past was a great heroic achievement that we are entrusted with and we are duty-bound to conserve and promote and defend. So it's really important that we push back against unfair, highly partisan, cartoonish, distorted readings of our past, because they will corrode our self-confidence and give succor to our enemies.
A lot of where we see these culture wars playing out is at university campuses, academics, and you've experienced this, of course, as an academic yourself and being the subject of a attempted cancellation, thankfully an unsuccessful one.
Yep.
But that's not a pleasant thing to live through, I can imagine. What is going on with our universities where they have seen over the last few decades the homogenization of thought, the deplatforming of views that aren't part of that homogenous thought, and that they haven't really fostered the academic freedom and I guess the radical ideas of wherever on the political spectrum that we've seen in the past. Well, that the whole idea of a university was the search for truth and learning and teaching. And how can you do that with the trends that we see today?
So part of what's happened is that in recent decades, the proportion of academics in Anglophone universities, I don't know the statistic for Australia, but certainly the US and UK, and I imagine Australia too, that are left-wing has grown enormously. So I think about 40 years ago, it was reckoned that the proportion of left to right was sort of 70 to 30%. It's now 90 to 10. So lots of academics in Western universities hear nothing but left-wing views. And so there's an obliviousness actually to the possibility of reasonable views that differ. And then you add there's the minority of academics who are actively hostile, so that when yours truly in 2017 made public his views that I don't think that European British colonialism was all bad, I don't think that imperial government or colonial government was always illegitimate, that provoked an instant reaction from other academics who wanted to shut me down. So there is in certain quarters, not amongst the majority of academics, but among some academics, a very illiberal activist force whereby they don't want to discuss reasons for their views, actually because I think they half know that their views stand on very few reasons and if subjected to critical scrutiny would disintegrate. I've become increasingly convinced of that. So they're half aware of their intellectual weakness, therefore they shout and they scream and they intimidate successfully because most academics don't want a fight. So it's partly the noisy minority of ideologues, it's partly the conflict aversion of most academics, and then also the other factor is the way in which university administrations behave. Universities are businesses now. Most of them are in the business of competing for students, and they want to be on the right side of Twitter. Right? So astonishingly, in a way that 4 decades ago, grown-up senior managers and leaders of universities would not have capitulated. Nowadays, administrators and university leaders capitulate to noisy students.
Do you see morality as more of a feature in academic debates than it has been in the past? I mean, this sort of idea that you're morally wrong, saying that there are parts of empire that were good, therefore your ideas are illegitimate. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you on the facts and your evidence and why you think that. You are wrong, you're immoral,
yes,
and therefore cancelled. Because That seems to me, I mean, it's intellectually lazy,
Yep.
and lacking in curiosity that you'd think academics would have. But
Yep.
that seems to be a feature.
Yes, and I've wondered about the kind of springs of this, and I end up in my book actually resorting to spiritual terms because I think the aggressiveness, the refusal to engage in any kind of exchange, and the ugly, merciless moral self-righteousness is very evident. And I'm wondering what's behind this. And this is speculative, but I think most of us will have had experience of enjoying being a crusader. You know, we love to be right, and we kind of enjoy the power of seeing the wicked cast down. And I think that kind of crusading, where actually what the crusader really cares about is not the oppressed. They care about their own performance and how they appear. They're signaling their virtue, but they don't really care about the oppressed. So for one example of this would be, I mentioned this report that came out about ethnic disparities in Britain, the so-called Sewell report in 2021. And the report gave a rather nuanced account of the state of ethnic disadvantage in Britain. And it said, no, racism is not always the cause of ethnic disadvantage. And I read the pages of the Guardian newspaper, the left-wing newspaper in Britain, in response to the report, and noticed how, judging by the Guardian, the left-wing response was instant dismissal, no thoughtful engagement at all. And then I thought to myself, someone who really cares about overcoming unjust disadvantage would really care about understanding the nature of the problem. So if someone comes along and says, no, the problem is not just racism, there's evidence that the problem is elsewhere, you might be skeptical, but you'd give it airtime, you'd look at it, you'd think about it, you'd argue with it, because you care about solving the problem. Because if you don't get the diagnosis right, you won't get the remedy right. But this is not how they behaved. So that raises the question, if they don't care about solving the problem, what is it they care about? And I think it's about, yes, it's the ego, it's the sense of being a crusader, but of course their crusading personae have attracted social support, they've sometimes attracted professional roles, and it would cost them a lot, professionally, socially, personally, to give up the role. And I think this is not about the oppressed, this is about the performance of the crusader.
I want to end on an optimistic note, Nigel,
yes,
and
please.
there is cause for optimism. You're doing exciting new things, well, in the UK more broadly, not just at the University of Oxford.
Yes.
You've got the Pharos Foundation, you're chair of the Free Speech Union.
Yep.
I mean, is there cause for hope for free speech and Western civilization?
Oh, absolutely, Georgina. So I've been saying here that, you know, when I first fell into trouble over my views on colonialism in 2017, I was alone. But in the last 4 years in Britain, we had the launching of the Free Speech Union, which now has 20,000 subscribing members, which gives the FSU UK an annual income from subscriptions alone of $2 million Australian. The FSU UK has helped to set up sister organizations in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and shortly Canada. And the FSU is sufficiently well-resourced now that it can even take the government to court. So institutions and government are now being held to account in a way they never were before. And through alliance with the centre and centre-right press, institutions are now being embarrassed in public, which means that taking the path of least resistance is no longer just giving in to noisy students. That's really important. And there are a number of other allied organizations that have sprung up among academics, not least also History Reclaim, which is trying to correct the record on British and other imperial history. You mentioned the Pharos Foundation, launched a year and a half ago in Oxford University, not controlled by it, but the idea is to promote thinking and scholarship that thinks that Western civilization has a lot to be said in favor of it. And we are presenting ourselves as allies of the university, and the university is not hostile to us. So I think, you know, this has all happened in 4 years, and it's all happened because people who were seriously upset about what was going on gathered together. They attracted people with resources who gave support, and institutions have been built. There's a long fight to be had. This is a generational struggle, I think, 10, 20 years. But in 4 years, a lot's been achieved. So that gives me a great deal of hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is I'm quite convinced The majority of people in Australia and Britain are not convinced. Progressives and woke people, they are highly sceptical of what's going on, many of them with non-white skins. And if somehow we can give those people ammunition and the courage to give voice to their doubts, I think in time the landscape will change.
Well, that's a very good note on which to end, Nigel. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks, Judy.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.